Welcome to this Fireside Discussion Chat with me, Terry Scarrett, Principal Consultant at Benchmark Minerals Intelligence. Right, well, I'm pleased to be joined by Michael Matan, General Motors Lead of Electric Vehicle Policy Strategy. Before we make some formal introductions, I'd just like to set the scene for this session. We'll be primarily talking about the challenges facing the auto industry, in particular developing a lithium-ion supply chain. And this is really where GM fits in here based on what they're currently doing and how they're trying to tackle some of the major challenges that are facing them and indeed other players in the industry today. And this is really on the back of GM's announcement earlier this year with their plans and quite ambitious plans for decarbonisation and net reduction in carbon and becoming carbon neutral by 2040. So before we get started, I'll just hand over to Michael to make a brief introduction.
Thanks, Terry, and I'm happy to be here. My name's Michael Maton, and I work on EV policy strategy. So both at the federal, state, and state levels, advocating for policies that are going to help us, GM and really the entire auto industry transition into this EV future, which, as Terry mentioned, we have very ambitious plans for the next 10 to 15 years. So really happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I guess a good place, a logical place to get started is really to take a step back and look at earlier this year when GM made that announcement to become carbon neutral by 2040. And one of the things that we do at Benchmark is we do track all the announcements that are going on in the industry, and in particular looking as well at what the major OEMs are doing. And we've been looking at with real interest at General Motors, in particular the fact that they've made an announcement to have a electrification target to 100% battery electric vehicle by 2035. And indeed, it seems that they're accelerating their partnership with the likes of Solid Energy Systems, and indeed there's some plans in China as well with sales with battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles from 2026. So it all points to a very exciting time ahead. And I guess a very good starting point on that is to really just gauge from your end, how does that picture look from General Motors' point of view? And sort of more broadly speaking, how does that fit in overall with sort of general policy? And then maybe we can start to sort of unpack a bit more detail on that as we go on.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And maybe just the thread of, I can go over the thread of our announcements, that announcement to be, carbon neutral by 2040, the aspirational target to eliminate emissions from our light duty fleet by 2035. And most recently, you might have seen alignment with the Biden administration as a goal of 40 to 50% EVs by 2030. So very ambitious targets. And what followed up those targets was a plan to invest $35 billion in our electric vehicle and autonomous vehicle technology by 2025. Which is a massive amount, right, of capital and investment that we're spending. More specifically, the announcement of 2 battery cell manufacturing plants to be built here in the U.S., one in Lordstown, Ohio, one in Spring Hill, Tennessee. The Lordstown one will actually start production next year, the Spring Hill the year after. We've also announced 2 further investment in 2 plants, 2 additional plants here in the U.S. by mid-decade. So you can kind of follow the string of announcements, and the first step really to building a supply chain here is frankly building those cell manufacturing plants. Investing with our partners, our joint venture partners, LG, in what we call the Ultium cells, which will form the basis for all our electric vehicles going forward. So we're really excited about those announcements, and we're also optimistic about what we're hearing from the policy side, from the federal administration to support all of those investments and all of those that those supply chains really coming here, regionally to North America and specifically to the U.S.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm glad that you instantly picked up on the investments in Lordstown, Ohio, and also in the other site as well in Tennessee. And as far as I understand, there's if I'm not mistaken, so those are both 35 gigawatt hour planned installations. Yeah,
correct. 35
okay.
gigawatt hours with room for expansion, as we like to say.
Right. So that I mean, looking at it as an outsider, that looks very ambitious and at the same time incredibly exciting. I'm wrestling my head how, there's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario going on here. You've got almost the major OEMs such as GM almost grabbing the bull by the horns and having to preempt with some of these investments and be bold. On the other hand, perhaps in recent years, there's been a slight mismatch with what the policymakers have been doing and saying with regard to investments going into the EV battery supply chain. All eyes have been on the Biden administration this year, of course, through the infrastructure bill. I think it's around $3.5 trillion pledged there. On the surface of it earlier in the year, it all sounded great. And as the years go on, we're sort of unpacking more information here. And I'm just very curious to see what's your viewpoint on that? How is this matching up from GM's perspective, and what needs to be done next?
Great. If I can correct you, the 3.5 trillion is actually in the budget spending bill it's going through reconciliation at this point. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is what contains some of the grants through the Department of Energy. So there's actually two potential funding mechanisms for not only cell production but raw material supply chain development. In the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's $3 billion for cell manufacturing plants, and additional $3 billion for supply chain development, and some additional money for recycling as well as research. All of that money flowing through the DOE. So again, we're quite optimistic that is, while not, let's say, exactly equal to what's going to be needed to build these supply chains to support 100% EVs, is a really good start and could really serve to jumpstart the building of these supply chains here. And we feel we've sent a great signal to the market saying we're going to build cells. We, GM and LG, are going to build cells in North America that are going to go into North American produced EVs that will be sold here. So that's a great signal to the market that there's going to be that demand. And I think it gives the confidence for multinational companies to look at investing here, as well as maybe some entrepreneurial startups to look at getting a piece of the raw material supply chains here. And let's remember, we're in a bit of a global race here. Europe is doing the exact same thing, right, with their battery blueprint. Roughly, I think $3.5 billion is what Europe has committed to building up their supply chains. So in many ways, we're in a bit of a race against other regions to make sure that we secure all of the materials that we need to build this incredible quantity of batteries.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, and this is something we see on benchmark side as well, that quite frankly, there is just a dearth of cell manufacturing going on in North America, in Europe. There are now, it's only recently that there have been announcements with some of the major OEMs, and some of it appears to be a bit of rhetoric, trying to, I guess, try to stimulate interest there, which of course has a snowball effect, and it's understandably so. You see the likes of the Teslas and VWs making quite ambitious announcements with their sort of mega gigafactories. It's no surprise to see finally the US or North America waking up to this, and from an outsider perspective, it's really pleasing to see. One of the challenges with this presumably is time to come on stream and to develop these, to get these, to optimize these supply chains as well. And from what we see, evidence in China, of course, they've had a much longer time to perfect this. They're not without considerable challenges there. And I wonder, from your perspective, what, how you view that, what needs to be done now. So we sort of unpack it from, we've looked at sort of broadly speaking on a policy side, from a technological standpoint or from a supply standpoint, what are the big sort of critical things that are on the horizon?
Sure. So the way I think I like to think about it, and the way I like to explain it to maybe the layperson, is on a time horizon, and then also break down the supply chains by steps. Of course, materials don't just come directly out of mines and go to battery cell plants. There's a lot of interim steps, right? They need to get changed into sulfites and hydroxides. They need to get combined into cathodes and anodes, and then they need to be shipped to the battery plants. So there's a lot of midstream processing that needs to occur here as well before you can even talk about extraction, because if you extract without having that midstream here in North America, you're just sending it to China or Asia, and gaining those frequent flyer miles again, which we know is just additional cost in the supply chain. So, the auto industry has 100 years. We optimize supply chains. That's what we do. Auto industry is in general a pretty low margin business, and it's critical to wring all of the cost and all of the inefficiencies out of the system. And that's what we're really looking at here. But it really begins with that midstream, because those are things, again, that can be done in say the next anywhere from 3 to 5 years. You can bring a cathode processing plant or an anode plant online in kind of that time frame. The extraction and mining is a much longer time frame, so we still need to start talking about that now. But I think a lot of the focus will be kind of moving upstream from the cell plant in the near term. And I think the overarching, and I want to mention this early and often, our overarching goal is to bring these supply chains to North America in a sustainable way at a competitive cost. Those are kind of our two guiding principles, really non-negotiable principles, for onshoring or nearshoring this supply chain. We know some of those interim steps are very energy intensive and potentially not as environmentally friendly as they need to be. So we need to be very cognizant of that as we move those here. And I'd say, I'm highlighting the challenges that we face. But yeah, that's kind of the way we're looking at it right now, looking at getting this midstream here, and also looking at longer term, where we can look at mining and extraction. An example of that is our funding, at least preliminary funding, of a company called CTR out in the Salton Sea, for potential lithium extraction from the Salton Sea. So funding those kind of longer term investment type projects, but also looking at bringing the midstream online as soon as we can to feed our battery factories.
It's really interesting you picked up on that point on the hydrothermal sourcing for lithium brine. That's the one in California, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, and that whole notion of onshoring, and I really like that term, because it's it is about localizing supply chains as best as you possibly can, and it falls within that ESG framework where you're looking at minimizing or mitigating your risks. You're looking at the environmental aspect, but quite critically as well, as you pointed out, the cost component also rolls into that. And you can have those multiplier effects if you can satisfy some, if not all of those conditions. And it's interesting you also picked up on the point about the cell or the cathode improvements as well. I'm quite interested or curious to hear a bit more on that front, because from what I understand, you're sort of moving away from the sort of NCM, you're going to or moving towards sort of a net reduction in cobalt, which solves some of the problems not all of them, of course. Yeah, and of course on lithium extraction. So, what maybe you could just comment a bit more around that, maybe a bit more on the cathode to begin with.
Yeah, great question on the cathode chemistries. I think, again, speaking just not only as GM, but from a general industry standpoint, in the US and really globally, we're still very early on in the development of the battery electric vehicle industry and the chemistries that will ultimately be there when, instead of 400,000 EVs a year, we're selling 17 million EVs a year in the US. The chemistries are going to look very different in the next 10 to 15 years. The question is how different, and again, it's whether it's how much of the market does the iron phosphate chemistry get us, or lithium metal anode, or like you said, cobalt-free content, or solid state applications. We have to build these supply chains with all of that in mind, really. The changing nature, right? So 4 years ago, we were asking for a lot of lithium carbonate. Now we're asking for lithium hydroxide, right? So it's just, and I don't want to highlight as this massive disruption to the industry, but it's an example of how this evolves. And we're going to be asking different things of that supply chain moving forward, even as we're kind of onshoring it. So, will one battery chemistry ultimately win out and be 100% of the market? Absolutely not. You have performance cars today with 12-cylinder engines. You have, eco cars with 3-cylinder engines. There's going to be a range of chemistries, a range of performance, and frankly, a range of costs. And GM, as a full line automaker, we have to consider all of that as we move forward and develop batteries with our partners, in that space. And again, yeah, I think that the lithium is a very interesting one, right? Lithium, there's no doubt lithium's going to be around. You can talk about all the other elements, but lithium is one that certainly is going to be there, and we're going to need a lot of it. So, how can we extract it sustainably? How can we recycle it, quite frankly, sustainably? Recycling will play a very large role in the future, maybe not today, but it's important to plant the seeds of that overall recycling industry today, so that when the volume does explode there, we can bring those raw materials back into the supply chain and not, again, ship them off somewhere and keep them in North America.
We'll revisit the recycling aspect in a minute.
Sorry about that.
I'm very curious to hear your view on that. Still focusing a bit more on the upstream. I'm glad that you mentioned a few points there, but I think we're generally aligned on that there is no silver bullet here for one battery chemistry solving all of the problems. And I think there's a sort of broad consensus in industry that there's going to be a multitude of solutions to solve the bigger problem or challenge, if you like. We're also seeing development of very sort of nascent industry, in particular next generation anode materials. It seems as though every conversation we have these days is someone wants to know about solid state. It seems to still be the hot topic. I wonder what your thoughts are on first of all how you sort of viewing these next generation technologies, and secondly, focusing on the anode. I think you mentioned already about some of the challenges with even bringing production and onshore, if you like, to North America, in particular graphite industry. We see there's some evidence already of definitive feasibility studies going on. We know that many of these projects will come on stream in the next few years, several years. They will, of course, be playing a major part of the building the narrative here in North America. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that and how we can also try and meet the sort of ESG part of that as well, because graphite's not without its challenges on that front. So it's quite
without giving away anything confidential, I can tell you we're involved in all of those conversations as we really start to pick apart the supply chain. There is the potential with with changing the anode to really gain some energy density and cost advantages. But I guess I'd really rather talk at a high level just about battery chemistries in general. I think we hear it's literally almost every month or even every week the latest and greatest solid state or new chemistry, or this is going to be the 1,000-mile battery, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's important to keep in mind, all of this is valid research. It takes years. You have to ensure that it works in a vehicle environment over many cycles. And just as importantly, you have to be able to manufacture it repeatedly. Those are two, and a lot of the technologies we're talking about or that are in the news are not necessarily, have not met those thresholds yet. So it's again, we're a bit trying to build the plane as we're trying to fly it, building these supply chains, knowing there will be a next generation chemistry. There's no doubt. But how does that, it's TBD how that will potentially affect not only supply chains, but manufacturing processes, right? The manufacturing process for a solid state is a little bit different than the manufacturing process for something with a liquid electrolyte. Mm-hmm. So those probably don't happen, just for instance, those probably don't happen on the same production line. So we're keeping an eye. We GM are keeping an eye on all of this, working with both our GM's R&D efforts, also with LG, but also I think the federal consortiums and the through the Department of Energy, Argonne National Lab, all of these, we appreciate the funding that's available in the infrastructure bill because we want those advances. We really want to turn the attention of all the great minds in the US and North America towards this battery issue. We think it's critical to the decarbonization to get to that. I'll just throw out a number, $50 a kilowatt hour cell level as soon as we can.
Yeah, going back to the point about the infrastructure bill and the investments needed, in your view, is it enough, or is it just merely a kickstart to facilitate the transition now to get to really get this to start snowballing?
It's probably a bit more than a kickstart, but if you're looking at, what do we need to transition the entire industry, this huge, one of the largest industries of the world, totally to EVs by 2035, it's probably not enough, but probably a little more than just a kickstart. I wouldn't short sell it. $3 billion isn't, for cell manufacturing it's not an insignificant amount of money, but our announcement of the Ultium cell plant was $2.3 billion for one plant. So it's a nice start. I'd compare it to another thing in the bill, which is a bit unrelated, is the $7.5 billion for charging infrastructure, for EV charging infrastructure. Is that exactly what's needed according to the experts? No, it's probably a fraction of what's needed, but it at least serves to get that industry kind of off the ground and running.
No, I couldn't agree more. We have been doing some modeling on that recently, and there's definitely there's quite a bit divergence on what needs to be invested in there, but nevertheless, we recognise that it's headed in the right direction.
And I would also point out that just as importantly is the mechanism for distributing this funding. That's kind of the next. So if we assume the bill gets passed in its current form, and we can all handicap that, the next step is, how is the DOE going to distribute? What are the mechanisms? What are the decision processes to distribute some of that funding?
Right. Yeah.
That's kind of the next step.
What do you see as being some of the biggest threats to progress here, short, mid, long term?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's the bandwidth of some of these multinational companies to invest in Europe, China, and the US all at once. In all of these, the ability of many of these midstreams to scale up to, right now it's, I would call it almost centralized production in Asia, in China in particular, and a bit in Korea, and the ability of those to move to more of a distributed model of production, with all of the raw materials coming in. I think, especially in the US, permitting processes are potentially a challenge to getting some of these things online. Again, we like to see in the infrastructure bill some mention of instructing the DOE to help streamline the permitting process for building some of these factories. That can take quite a long time, and I'm not sure there's a lot the federal government can do, quite frankly, because a lot of the permitting is at the state or provincial level. But we certainly see that as a potential hurdle to getting some of these to the rapid deployment of some of these midstream processing plants.
What is the primary reason for that? Is that just because the policymakers don't have, this is unprecedented, or they just don't know how to do it, or is different rules for different states if it's not sort of federal?
Exactly. Not a lot of oversight, and again, looking at environmental impact analyses and things like this, it's quite a bureaucratic process that you have to go through. We know this from our cell plant activities over the last couple of years. So we just want to be cognizant of the fact that these are these are large plants that we need to we need, the whole of government needs to work together to streamline these processes to get these plants online as soon as possible, so we can bring these here. I think the other, just to mention one other threat, I think is, I said we want to bring things here in a sustainable way at a competitive cost. And I think, potential price manipulation of the markets, we've seen this in some other raw materials, is a real concern of ours from a trade perspective. That once we start producing here at a very competitive cost, there's some manipulation of some of the markets that potentially make it difficult for us to be competitive here in North America.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the first point, from a domestic standpoint, it would seem that there are still some bottlenecks to be overcome then, to sort of overcome around bureaucracy, to really start assisting in speeding up some of these processes. And presumably if those can be overcome, that solves some of the problems, or at least it accelerates the pathway to ramping up capacity, at least from further downstream cell level. And then sort of looking away from North American markets, as you pointed out, one of the biggest challenges for incumbents in North America, in Europe, and all these conversations are going on at the moment, sort of from a legislative piece by the policymakers, is how to secure access to feedstocks, security of supply, and of course, broadly speaking, China sort of holds all the cards there. That's where all the cell manufacturing is. A lot of the raw materials are coming from there as well, not all, but there is fair to say that when we do track this at Benchmark as well on the price forecast, and even recently just with graphite, we saw that in a broadly consolidated market from sort of very few players, that there can be some sort of price fluctuations there, and they do have an impact on incumbents as well, on mining companies. Yeah, and I think we have to point to some examples there. Yeah,
I think it's up to GM, right, to work with our suppliers kind of all the way down the chain, because we're not necessarily directly sourcing graphite. We're working with our partners, right, to kind of the LGs, and then going down the line of looking at that. But absolutely, security of feedstock, to enable this vision to rapidly, ramp up production at all of these cell plants, almost, opening 2 cell plants within 2 years is darn close to simultaneous. So you're really looking at trying to get that ramped up as soon as possible, working with kind of all the suppliers. Now again, we GM have, a vehicle is 10,000 parts. So we have thousands of suppliers we're working with from a vehicle assembly standpoint. From a the battery cell manufacturing standpoint, that number's a little less, but we can at least bring some of our expertise in those areas to bear when we're working, creating these, call it, new supply chains for auto manufacturers.
Mm. So I'm conscious of time. In the interest of time, maybe we can now jump a bit further downstream to battery recycling, and really interesting to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, on one hand, you size it up as a challenge. On the other hand, it's a clear opportunity, and it sort of fits into that broader narrative around circular economy and environmental social governance. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. What can be done? What is being done? How can that be achieved, sort of broadly speaking?
A great question. I can tell you we're all learning about battery recycling, and one thing I've learned over the last couple of years is when you get into the battery cell manufacturing business, you sort of by default get into the recycling business, and because battery cell manufacturing plants throw off a lot of scrap material because the purity needs to be there for battery cells. So you're especially during startup, you're creating a lot of scrap, which of course is valuable material to be recycled. So when we're building these cell manufacturing plants, you might have noticed we have a partnership with a company called Li-Cycle, which is going to take the scrap from the Lordstown facility. So we're definitely involved in that. The biggest challenge there, or the biggest opportunity, is can you make recycling value positive? Right? Can you, for a given battery, for a given battery module or a cell, can you process that in a way and sell the components for more than it costs you to process it? The biggest component of battery recycling, of electric vehicle battery recycling right now, is logistics. And what I mean by that is where that battery goes out of service, transporting that battery to a recycling facility is the single largest cost of recycling currently. So we have some proposals to look at how can we first of all work with the government, maybe create some consortiums to reduce some of that cost through a hub and spoke system, through what are some policy mechanisms that the first thing is to make people aware that this logistics issue, again, for a vehicle that goes out of service in, I'll just make it up, Arizona, and you have to transport it to your recycling facility in Oklahoma. How do we make that, you're never going to get around having to transport it somewhere. So once you have the logistics kind of taken care of, we believe there's enough innovation in the recycling industry through hydrometallurgical processes instead of pyrometallurgical processes. We believe there's enough innovation that's occurring in that industry right now that we can create a positive value chain out of that. So our view is if we can get some help from industry or from the government on that transportation issue, we can make a positive recycling story. And again, if you can recycle that material and have the midstream processes for that recycled material to go back into, even better.
So it's sort of shifting. I mean, in a way, you're facilitating some of the existing supply chains to sort of have a bit more of a feedback loop, which in one way sort of it means you've got the integration there. On the other hand, you're going with a sort of relatively or broadly new way of looking things, potentially disrupting what you already have. and quite significantly.
Mhm.
And therefore, that's going to require not only help from the policymakers, but also significant investments as well.
Yeah, and it really takes a whole of industry approach. We're going to have to work with our dealers. We're going to have to work with our dismantlers, and we're going to have to work with the recyclers. So it's a different kind of cross industry collaborative approach that's going to be necessary to make sure that these batteries, end up in a recycling facility.
Who this might be my ignorance on this, but in your view, who holds all the risk in this? Is it the cell manufacturers? Is it ultimately the automakers? In terms of sort of battery recycling, where does the buck stop at present?
I think we would say we want nobody to have the risk because we want the batteries to be positive value. So if there's a positive market value, there's really no risk in, I mean, just frankly, just like scrap vehicles today. Those scrap vehicles are not in landfills because there's a positive value for all of that metal that's contained in the vehicle. And if we can create this chain of batteries as well, we think it's really on everybody. We think battery manufacturers, we think auto manufacturers, we think, again, recyclers and dismantlers. We don't want to really assign the risk or the blame or the responsibility on any of these. We need to kind of create this whole of industry approach to do this. Again, focusing at least at this point on the pretty overwhelming logistics problem that this represents when you have 2,000-pound battery going out of service in rural Maine and having to get that battery to and again, it's small numbers today. So let's deal with it when it's small numbers instead of when it becomes larger numbers. I would say in general, what we're dealing with today is more on the module perspective. We're not dealing with out of service whole batteries. We're dealing with really out of service modules. So it's a bit of an easier issue, but in the future, clearly there will be these batteries coming back. And I would also say the other, just to highlight one other issue, the reuse of vehicle batteries. We think there's some potential reuse. I think the jury's still out a little bit on the best application for reuse of some of these batteries, but frankly, they're going to have 70-80% of their health still, their energy retaining capacity left. So there is potential that these could get used in stationary storage applications, for example. I don't think that's going to solve the entire problem, but it could absolutely help mitigate some of the impact of all of these batteries going out of service.
Yeah, indeed, and I think we're generally aligned on that, particularly with the NMC chemistries. Just had a conversation yesterday with some stakeholders around LFP as well. So there's a lot of interest in LFP at the moment, and it's not going away. But equally, we're also looking on the horizon at other competing technologies like sodium ion, and things are moving so quickly in industry that one day no one believes in it, and the next day everyone does, and it only takes that one thing to unlock the potential there.
And from a policy perspective, we're really looking for encouragement of opportunities and not to constrain innovation by creating policies, recycling policies, quite frankly, that could possibly could add cost to the battery or constrain innovation in any way. We want to keep our minds open about what could potentially happen in this market, in the innovation that might occur in the future. We don't want to necessarily again have policies that could inhibit some of that innovation from occurring. And I think recycling is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Through fear of running over time, I'm going to stop there. Before I do, I'd just like to thank you for this great chat. I mean, I wish we could continue it, and I'm sure we will offline at some point. So once again, thank you, Michael, for your time. I'll leave the last word with you, if you like. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
I guess the last word is for the audience is really that the GM and the entire auto industry is committed to this transition. We're going to make it happen. This isn't double talk. It's a real transition. It's a real strategy. You'll start seeing those Hummer EVs and the Cadillac Lyriq on the road in the next few months. So please check them out.
Can't wait.
Thanks.
Well, pleasure. Thanks.